Melin are also good friends of ours. And yesterday, Karen and I were invited to join them on a Zoom prayer meeting. They left today for Cameroon. And so we were able to spend about a half an hour with them and other people who are involved in their lives as well. And we had a good time of prayer. Anyway, they are going to have a special Facebook page for the time that they're gone. And so I've joined that. And so as they send out pictures, I'll be sharing that as well. So over the next couple of Sundays, as they are back in Cameroon ministering, if they send some pictures on Facebook, I'll make sure I put those in my sermon as well and to share that. So anyway, we want to remember Tim and Amy in prayer as they head back to Cameroon, and they're looking forward to spending time, again, reconnecting with their friends. Back in 1998, I began my ministry in Rush City. At the time, Karen and our 4 children were back in Waseca because the 2 oldest kids were in elementary school. And so what I would do is that they would drop me off in Rush City early in the week, and then I would spend the middle part of the week getting in the office, getting familiar with the church family, visiting people, doing sermon preparation, and then on the weekends they'd come and get me, and I'd spend the weekend with them. I needed a car to get around, and so one of the men in the church volunteered his aunt's car because his aunt was very elderly, and he didn't want Helen driving anymore. And if you saw Helen driving around town with her dog in her lap, you wouldn't want Helen driving around either. And so Dale used the new pastor as the excuse because he knew that Helen was all about ministry, that she would not say no to the new pastor. And so for the weeks I was there before my family moved up, I drove Helen's Escort around. Helen was a wonderful elderly lady. I want to tell you a little bit about her and then tell you a story about her. She was born in October 28th of 1912. She lived in rural Rosheba Township, and she grew up on the family farm up there. She was baptized as a member of the East Rock Creek Baptist Church. Much like Hillman, there were many Baptist churches in the rural area in that Cambridge and over into the Rush City area. And so there was an East Rock Creek Church at the time, years ago. She graduated from Rush City High School in 1930. She received her teacher's diploma in 1935. She graduated from Bethel Institute in 1939, and then she received her bachelor's degree from Sioux Falls College in 1947. Helen began a teaching career, and it began in all the one-room schoolhouses in the Rush City area. But Helen also was called to the foreign field, and so in 1948, one of the very first missionaries that went out with Converge or the conference, she was going to go to the country of China as a single woman as a missionary. Well, in 1948, there was the Great Revolution, and therefore her plans to go to China were interrupted, and so she ended up going to the country of India. And so she spent many years as a single lady teaching in the country of India and serving the gospel. She retired from the mission field in 1977, but she always remained faithful, and so even as she came back home, she lived in a trailer house on the farm of her nephew, and she was very faithful in church, and she was a great prayer warrior. And so when we moved to Rush City in 1998, and Helen was well into her 80s, and you go out to visit her, and she had these long prayer lists that she would spend the day. Helen preferred the company of cats. And so whenever I would visit Helen, I would make sure I put old clothes on because I knew that when I came home, I would smell of cats when I got back home. The other thing is, if Helen ever offered you food or drink, you always said that you were full and not thirsty because the cats spent more time on the counters than human beings spent on the counters. But she was a wonderful woman. Anyway, several years before Helen passed away at the age of 96, a lady came back to town who'd grown up as a young girl in Rush City. Her family were not believers, and so when she was young, she was not raised in a Christian home. When she moved away and became an adult, she came to know the Lord later in life. When she got older, she wanted to move back to town, and there were a number of elderly women in the Rush City area that, in her mind, were a godly influence, and so she wanted to honor them. And so one day she stopped at my office, she introduced herself to me, And she told me her plan, and she told me that Helen was one of the elderly ladies that had always impressed her, that even though she was not a Christian, Helen's faith had always impressed her. And so she wanted to honor Helen. And this is the way she wanted to honor Helen. She wanted to publicly wash Helen's feet in a church service. Well, by this time I knew Helen quite well, and I just knew that would not be something that Helen would feel comfortable with. But I said, well, I would talk to her. And so I mentioned it to her nephew, Dale, and Dale says, no, that doesn't sound like Helen at all. But the desire on the part of this woman, she wanted to honor Helen. And she wanted to honor the older ladies that had lived a godly life when she was a young girl. And that is what we're going to talk about today as we continue on in our sermon series on the one another commands. And so as Dave read for us, we are in Romans 12, and I'd invite you to turn there as well. As is my habit, I'd like to do just a bit of review. Again, to remind that when we come to the book of Romans, most of us, I'd like us to remember the basics of the book of Romans. And that is that Paul had never been to Rome. Paul had not started this church, but Paul is now toward the end of his third missionary journey. He's in the city of Corinth. And Paul has a plan. He wants to visit 3 cities. He wants to go back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. Then he wants to make his way to Rome, minister there a while, and then he'd like them to send him on to Spain as he begins to evangelize the western part of the Roman Empire. And therefore, in Paul's letter is a letter of introduction. He goes into his theology as he explains what he believes about God and about salvation and things like that. We had mentioned that because Paul had not started the church at Rome, the church at Rome most likely had started from the day of Pentecost, that there were Jewish believers who'd come back to Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost. They had heard Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. They had responded to the gospel, and then they had gone back to Rome. We also noted that because of the Roman Empire and their road system, travel was very common in those days, and so over the years, there were many people that Paul had met elsewhere in the Roman Empire, led them to the Lord, and because of business and other reasons, they have moved to Rome, and therefore, even toward the end of Paul's letter, he can mention quite a few people that he knows in Rome, having met them before. We are now in the latter part of Paul's letter, which is more practical. And in this section, as Dave read, there are actually 3 one another commands. We're only going to look at 2 today, and then we'll begin looking at the other one, living in harmony with one another, next week. And so let us talk about these 2 commands. The first one is found in Romans 12 and verse 10. I'll read verse 9 just for context. Paul says, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good." And then in verse 10 he says, "Love one another with brotherly affection." I put up there, I'm trying to help you learn Greek. Do anyone have an interest in learning Greek? Should we start a Sunday school class? I could teach you Greek. No. I jokingly tell the people at my church, I periodically put a Greek word up there just so you think I'm educated, okay? But you actually know that word, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. The reason why I want to put it in context, in verse 9, when Paul says, "Let love be genuine," he uses a different Greek word. There are 3 basic Greek words that are translated love, but they all have different nuances. The one in verse 9 is the more common word we know as agape love, that sacrificial love. And we're going to look at that a little bit later on. And so he uses that word, but then in verse 10, when he says love one another, he uses a second word. We think of the word philos, fidelity. That's more of that brotherly love. And if you could read Greek, he actually uses 2 philos words. It's philos storgoi, and then Philadelphia. And so when he says love one another with brotherly affection, he's talking more about that familial feel within a church family where we need to treat each other like we're brothers and sisters in Christ. So we may not be biologically related, but we ought to be soteriologically. We should be related because of salvation. And so we're talking about a family where it is characterized by an affection that is treated in terms of brother and sister. I had a family in my very first church that was actually the opposite. They were biologically related, but you could not tell it by their interaction. They were not exactly a loving family. And the humorous thing is that we had another couple. They were professors of music at Pillsbury Baptist Bible College, and so they came over to Waseca where I pastored. They had been in our church for maybe close to a year. And we had them over for Sunday dinner that day. And we were just talking about the people. Anyway, I think we just mentioned, in passing, we mentioned that the Carlson grandchildren were related to the Fowlers. And the look on this couple's face was, they're related? Again, they were not exactly a loving family. You could not tell that this was a normal grandmother, grandfather. There were actually 3 generations, but the way they interacted or their lack of interaction, you had no clue that they were actually biologically related. What Paul is getting at, within a church family, we may not be biologically related, but we need to treat each other as if we were. And so when Paul talks about these words, he's talking about a tender affection that is rendered by individuals who cherish one another and they treat each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. Tomorrow, late afternoon, I'll be driving down to the airport in Minneapolis. I am picking up my older sister, Kathy. She is coming in to visit my mom, and she's going to spend the week with us. I have 2 sisters who live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and once a year we go to visit them. One of the reasons why I like to visit my sisters is because they dote on me. My sisters love me. In fact, they have all whispered in their ear, don't tell your brothers, but you're our favorite. And so anyway, when we go down there, my sisters, they know all the foods I like, and they make sure that all the foods I like are going to be there, and are going to be there almost in too much of a supply. In fact, it actually, I think, irritates Karen a little bit. She thinks it's rather foolish how much they dote on me. But my 2 sisters do that, and so my sister Kathy, when she knows I'm coming down, she starts baking all of my favorite cookies and snacks that I like to have with my tea. My youngest sister, Mary, we normally stay at their place because it's larger. My sister, Mary, will deliberately go and buy all the specific foods that she knows I like. For example, I like a cup of yogurt. She buys, I like Noosa yogurt, and I like the raspberry. She will buy, they'll be in the refrigerator, there'll be stacks of Noosa. I mean, more than I can even eat in the week that I'm going to be there. And so what's fun about it is that my sisters treat me that way, which is why I like going down there. What Paul is getting at is that within a church family, that's the way we need to treat each other. You need to feel from the other people in their church that, in a sense, in a nice way, you are doted upon, that you are cared for, that you are appreciated. And so Paul conceived of the local church as a family that's even closer than a biological family. Again, I have been in churches where there are people who are biologically related, and that can be good if it's not too much. There can be a danger if there's too much of that. But what Paul said, that there should be this feeling with when you walk into church, you should walk in and feel that there are people there who have a deep affection for you and who demonstrate that. In fact, there's a verse, in fact, we'll put it up on the screen before you. This comes out of 1 Timothy chapter 5, where I think Paul brings that up. Paul says, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men, treat them as brothers. Older women as mothers. Younger women as sisters, all in purity. When I took the church in Waseca, I inherited an older woman. Her name is Joanne. Very sweet woman until you cross her. There were many times over the 22 years where as she would walk out, she kind of bite my head off because maybe I said something that she didn't like. But invariably, she would show up Tuesday morning to apologize. That's just the way she was. And so I had a pattern with her, especially after her husband died. She became even a bit more critical. And so there were things that would happen in the church that she didn't like. I remember when we got rid of our pews and got chairs, I knew that she would not like that. And so, being Joanne, she did speak her mind. But I knew that all I'd have to do is call her up, and if you're willing to have a tea party with her, by the end of the 2 hours, she's no longer mad at you. And the point was, she had to get it off her chest. She had to tell you how she felt, At the same time, she knew that I loved her, and she knew I treated her like my mother, and therefore, when I left, all was well again. All it required was a tea party. And so in the 22 years I was there, I probably had about a tea party at least once a year with Joanne, because that's what was needed. And that's what Paul is talking about. He's talking about that when you are with the older men in church, you treat them like you treat your own father. When you're with the older women, you treat them the way you treat your mother. The men of the church, you treat them like a brother, you treat them like a sister. And so Paul is getting at that there should be this feeling as well. Now, as I mentioned in verse 9, when Paul says, let love genuine, he did use a different word, and that is the common word agape. I'll pose a question, and you may choose or may not choose to answer it. If you had to think of the classic passage in the Bible that defined biblical love, does a passage come to your mind? We always read it at weddings, right? 1 Corinthians 13, okay? And so I'll put it up there. And so in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast, is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. We're going to come back to that passage in a little bit. I want to kind of describe it again, but that's a great description of how you and I need to interact as a church family and how we need to treat one another. As I mentioned from last week when I preached on the resurrection, remember a statement that Jesus gave the disciples. We'll put it on the screen. This comes from John 13. This was in the upper room where Jesus told the disciples, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And if you remember the importance of that, remember even at the Last Supper, they were arguing over who was more important to Jesus. Even at the Last Supper, they were not loving each other. And therefore, in these final words before Jesus died and left them, he said, I'm going to give you a brand new commandment that you have not been doing. And that is that you are going to start loving one another. And that is how people will know that you are my followers. Years later, John the Apostle, having learned this lesson, he would write the following verse, 1 John 4, verses 7 and 8. He says, Beloved, those who have been loved by God, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever has been born of God knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. And so with that in mind, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 13, and let's kind of describe what Paul talks about. What Paul is saying is that love is not primarily an emotion. Love is primarily an action. And so let's look at the categories that Paul talks about. Love is patient and kind. I remember last year as churches went into kind of lockdown and began to deal with COVID, I began to see people in churches who did not demonstrate a lot of grace with each other. I remember in particular people venting, especially on Facebook. That's where you go to vent nowadays, right? You go to Facebook to vent all your frustration. And so I remember in particular the idea that love is patient and kind. I have a pastor friend of mine, and he pastored up in the Brainerd area, a rather large church up there. He and I were Facebook friends. And so when the governor kind of shut the state down for a while, and he was going to follow that, one day he made an announcement on there that they weren't going to be meeting for a while. And what followed, and I followed the conversation for about 2 hours, people began to express their opinion about what they thought the rightness or wrongness of that. And I saw a lot of people who were no longer kind, who were no longer gracious toward one another. It goes on to say, love has the capacity to be wronged and not retaliate. One of the conversations I saw, one of the men in this man's church said, you know what? We need a leader like Moses who's going to stand up and say, let my people go. But I thought the pastor was very gracious. He said, yeah, but you have to remember, Moses waited over 400 years before he said that. And so he took a shot, but he didn't get mean-spirited about it. He just tried to bring some humor to it. Biblical love is the capacity to be wronged and to not retaliate. Love is patient, and patience is connected to kindness. Paul said that in Colossians chapter 3. He says, "Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience." The disposition to be kind is the opposite, or is the positive counterpart to being patient. Then he keeps going on. He says, "Love will endure evil and injury and provocation without being filled with indignation, resentment, or revenge. Love does not envy or boast. Love is not grieved at the success of others, nor does it behave as a braggart and call attention to oneself. Love is not arrogant or rude. Love does not behave indecently or in a shameful manner. Love will never embarrass someone else. Love does not insist on its own way." And so think about that in the context of a church family. Again, I have been a part of churches for 62 years, almost 63 years of my life. I have seen churches behave well, and I've seen churches behave poorly. And so Paul is talking about how we treat one another. Think about what the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Philippi. Philippians 2, verse 4 says this, "Let each of you look not only on his own interest, but also on the interest of others," and that is necessary in a church family. Going on, love is not quick-tempered or long-time angry. Love, when injured, does not take a record of the injury in order to pay back at a later date. I will not name this lady, but there was one lady, I would say, as her pastor, she loathed me. I use the word loathe. I could use the word hate, but hate's not a deep enough word the way she loathed me. And the reason why she loathed me is because she loathed other people as well. She married one of the guys in my church. She came from Pennsylvania. And so when she married this guy and moved to town, I became her pastor, and so I got to know her. One day, she came into my office for a visit. And for the next 2 hours, she proceeded to tell me the names of every individual from her child and on who had crossed her. And she had a very good memory. She could remember school teachers and Sunday school teachers and just people in general. What I realized that she had made a very detailed list of people who had wronged her. And therefore, I knew it would not take long for me to join that list because she had such a perfect memory. And sure enough, within a year, I did something as her pastor that she did not like, and therefore I got put on the list. I got put in the book. And therefore, she would demonstrate her loathing for me. She would sit in the auditorium during the singing part. When it came time for me to preach, she always had to use the restroom. And invariably, it seemed to take at least a half an hour for her to finish in the restroom. And when I got done, she would often come back into the auditorium. And so she was an individual. She had a very detailed list of people who had wronged her. And she never forgave them. The one thing I've learned to being a part of a church family, you better have a forgiving heart, because eventually, I know that I am going to do something that is going to offend some of you. I will not do it on purpose. And if you tell me, I will try not to do it again. But I just know human nature. I will probably offend some of you. And therefore, we need to have that attitude. He goes on to say, love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. A couple of years ago, I was at a Rush City basketball game. I have this habit, if kids in my church are in sports or in music, I go to the concerts, I go to their games. And so I was at the game, and I think we were playing Pine City. And during the game, it got a little chippy, as things can happen between Rush City and Pine City. They get chippy. Anyway, during the game, one of the Pine City boys roughly fouled one of the Rush City kids, and all of the Rush City parents became indignant because that could have been their child. As the game proceeded and continued to get chippy, one of the Rush City boys very roughly fouled a Pine City one. And the funny thing, all those same parents who had been upset began to clap. Why? Because it was their kid. And apparently it was okay. Paul says love does not do that. Love does not rejoice in that. Doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing. Love finds no satisfaction in sin, but rather rejoices in what is righteous. Love expresses itself in truth and acts according to that. And so that's what Paul said. That should be what characterizes this church family. There should be demonstrations of love, demonstrations of affection, demonstrations of familial satisfaction. One of the verses I remember out of the book of Proverbs, which to me is great for a church family, it talks about the idea of having a forgiving spirit. Proverbs 10, I love verse 12. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. To me, that's a great thing to have within a church family. Love covers all offenses. It doesn't mean we ignore it, we deal with it, but we deal with it in a biblical way, in a loving way, and then you cover. What Paul is saying is that love never ceases to have faith. It never loses hope. It has a tenacity to it. So, commandment number 1, we are to love one another with brotherly affection. Let's move on to the second one, which is also found in verse 10. It says, outdo one another in showing honor. There's a good way to have competition. And the good way to have competition is that you and I, in our treatment of one another, especially in this church family, we need to outdo one another in showing honor. Literally, the way the phrase is treated in the Greek, it's the idea of esteeming one another in love. See, when you esteem someone, you hold them in high regard. And you let them know that you hold them in high regard. You recognize their worth. And you publicly express their worth to them. When I was able to have my Proverbs commentary printed, I had sent it out to individuals who had taken on my support as a missionary to Ukraine. But then one day it dawned on me, there had been a lot of professors, especially of Bible, in Bible college and in seminary, who had greatly invested in my life back in the time when I did not look like I would amount to much. And therefore I began to think especially of those men. And so there were a group of about 10 men in my life who, whether in Bible college or seminary, had invested. And so what I did is that I sent them a copy of my commentary, and I wrote to them what they meant to me. One in particular, he was a professor of missions at Pillsbury. His name was Sam Toloin. He still is alive. He actually lives in Michigan. I had not seen him in years. Anyway, back when I was young, when I was in Bible college, I did not look like I'd amount to much. I was a spiritual dud. I didn't take any interest in spiritual things. I didn't have any interest in studying the Bible, but because of my parents, I had to go there. And so I took a lot of missions classes because I was also learning Spanish. He was the one who actually encouraged me to, back then we had a program called the MAP program, Missionary Apprenticeship Program. I told Juanita that their child is in Peru. I spent the summer in college in the country of Peru, and that changed my life. Because in Peru, I realized that I actually did have some spiritual talents. I just had to start using them. And even though I never went back to Peru, that trip changed my life. And so I wanted to let him know, and so I wrote to him in the book, and then we connected over email. And so I wrote him a fairly lengthy version of my life, especially I told him about my 18 years of teaching in Ukraine, because I knew that he would be delighted that I had finally amounted to something. But he needed to know, I wanted to honor him. He deserved my honor because he made a difference in my life. And that is the way we need to treat one another in a church family. We need to honor each other. Paul said something very similar. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3 says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility honor others more significant than yourselves. The last time I was in Ukraine, the seminary I've taught at for 18 years was going to celebrate their 25th anniversary. There's going to be a 2-day celebration. Ukrainians love celebrations, and they love long celebrations. They want a celebration that's going to go maybe 4 hours. And so anyway, during that, there was a 2-day thing. So I was teaching at the school that week, and then on Friday and Saturday was going to be the celebration. So on Saturday morning, the auditorium is packed. In fact, so I'm up front there. That's where I sit. So a lot of the former students that come back, a lot of people I administer to, during one of the sessions, they were going to call it, there were a lot of Americans who have been going over to Ukraine for years and invested. And I was one of them who'd been there the longest. And so anyway, they had a master of ceremony, and he was fairly new to the school. He'd only been there for the last 2 years, and so I jokingly say he didn't realize how important I was. Anyway, they were going to kind of do they were going to have they wanted to talk to a bunch of people who had been invested in Ukraine. So one by one, they began to call up individuals who had been coming to the seminary for years. And so a lot of my friends were up there. And I'm sitting there, and I'm just waiting for my name to be called because I'm so important. And finally it dawned on me, they stopped calling names. And even my friends on the stage are kind of wondering, they're going like, why aren't you up here? And all of a sudden I started thinking, doggone it, why am I not up there? And I found myself getting irritated because they don't realize how important I am. As they began to interview the other pastors who've been coming, God began to convict me of my arrogance. And I realized that the best thing for me was to sit in my pew and sit there. By the time we got done, God had taught me a valuable lesson. I'm not as important as I thought I was. And even a little later on, they came to apologize. You know, to be honest, it was actually a great lesson for me to learn. Why was I going to Ukraine? Was I going to Ukraine so that I'd be noticed? Or was I going there because I wanted to serve God? And so we are to honor one another. Let me close by looking at two passages that talk about in particular. So the first one, young people. I want to talk to you first of all. What is your primary obligation when it comes to honor? Your parents. That's the starting point. And so Paul would write to the church in Ephesus, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. And he actually explained this is the first commandment with the promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long on the land. As a pastor, when kids in my church will come to me and vent about their unreasonable parents, and it has happened over the years, I never take their parents' side. And I remind them, you may think your parents are unreasonable, but God has given them to you. And your primary job is to honor them. So kids, I'm going to give you an assignment this week, and I'd like to hear from the parents. I want you to shock your mom and dad this week and do something spontaneous that they will not see coming that would actually honor your parents. Okay? Can you think of something? I can tell Leah's thinking right now. Okay? So that's my first assignment. I want you to do something for your parents this week that is totally unexpected, and it's not asked for. They didn't ask for it. Okay? Do that. Then we have another passage, and this is now to the husbands. 1 Peter chapter 3. It says here, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Notice how Peter connects your treatment of your wife with God's treatment of you. And so God will treat the husband the same way the husband treats his wife. I will close with one final one, and that is out of 1 Peter, where Peter says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So I want you to be thinking, in terms of this local church, how can you make the other people who come to the church feel like they are honored? One of the things that I tried to do, especially as a pastor, I try to be involved in the lives of my people. As a habit, as their pastor, if I were your pastor, I would call you on your birthday, including kids. I've always called kids on their birthday and let them know what I think of them. I also call couples on their anniversary, and I always call the husband first, because sometimes he's forgotten. I remember one day I called one of the couples, and I called the husband first, and I could tell it caught him off guard, and I told him I'd be calling his wife next. He says, you cannot tell Tracy I forgot. So I did keep my vow of silence there. To me, go to each other, be involved in each other's lives. Go to their parties. Go to their graduation parties. Go to their weddings, special events. We need to be involved in each other's lives. So I'm going to give you as a church an assignment as well. I would like you to do something concrete. Say something specific this week to someone else in church that lets them know that you honor them. Next Sunday, we'll come back and we'll take a look at learning how to live in harmony with one another. I will close in a word of prayer, and then I think actually during the song, Karen and I will actually go to the back. Some of you I have not met yet, so I'll actually try to get back to the back and actually make you look me in the eye and greet me. But again, let's close in a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful again for the Word of God and for its practical application. And so I do pray for this church family that they will demonstrate legitimate love toward one another in a brotherly and sisterly way of showing genuine affection. And that we will learn to honor each other and to express that in ways that are meaningful to each other. And so I just pray for the health of this church family, that they will be the family that has been united because of Jesus Christ, and that they will demonstrate to each other the affection that is necessary for people to feel appreciated and to feel valued. And so I pray your blessing upon this church family. In Jesus' name, amen. I got a helper.
"591, we will sing verses 1 and 4.